In 1965, a geneticist named Jo Hin Cheo was staring through a microscope at a set of human chromosomes when he noticed something that should not have been possible. Every great ape on Earth, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, carry 24 pairs of chromosomes. Every one of them, without exception. Humans carry 23. Not because we lost a chromosome, because 2 of theirs had been fused into 1 of ours. Scientists would later call it chromosome 2, and they would spend the next several decades confirming, gene by gene, marker by marker, that the fusion was real, that the seam was visible, that somewhere in our ancestry, 2 separate chromosomes had been welded into a single strand of DNA. Mainstream biology calls this a natural mutation, a rare fusion event that happened once, was passed down, and eventually became fixed in the entire human population. That is the official story, and for most of genetic history, no one questioned it. But in 1957, 8 years before Cheo's discovery was even published, a small tablet fragment sitting in a storage crate at a research annex outside Baghdad was already describing something that reads, "When placed next to the chromosome 2 fusion, like an uncomfortable coincidence," or like a confession written 4,000 years before the microscope existed to confirm it. Before we go further, if ancient texts that quietly predict modern discoveries are the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, subscribe now, because this channel exists to surface the fragments nobody else is willing to translate on camera. Now, let's get into what the tablet actually says. The fragment was recovered from a storage annex tied to the old Iraq Museum excavation records, part of a batch pulled from a site near ancient Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever built, older even than Uruk, older than Ur. Eridu tablets are notoriously sparse. Most of what survives from the site is temple accounting, barley rations, canal repairs, offerings to the god Enki, who the Sumerians credited with shaping the first humans out of clay. But this particular fragment, catalogued only by a partial reference number after part of the original tag was lost, was not accounting. A visiting research fellow working through the annex in the late 1950s, his notes survive, though his full name does not, listed only as R. Halloway in a handful of internal correspondence, flagged the tablet as anomalous and set it aside for further review. That review never happened. The annex lost funding. The fellow returned to the UK, and the tablet sat in a numbered crate, unphotographed and untranslated, for almost 30 years. It was finally translated in the mid-1980s by an independent Sumerologist working from photographs taken before the annex records were partially lost during the political upheaval of the following decades. Her translation was never submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. She circulated it instead among a small correspondence network of independent cuneiform researchers, the kind of private, unofficial channel through which a surprising amount of unpublished Mesopotamian material still moves today. What she found, according to her notes, was a text unlike anything else recovered from Eridu. Not a hymn, not a king list, not a ritual instruction. A record of a decision made by the makers of the first humans about what those humans would and would not be allowed to keep. The tablet opens with a phrase that Sumerologists call a transmission marker, a formal opening used when a scribe wants to signal that the words that follow are not his own invention, but a copy of something older, passed down and preserved rather than composed. The phrase translates roughly as, "what was spoken before the reeds were cut," meaning before writing itself existed. The scribe is telling us in the very first line that he is not the author. He is a courier, and then the text describes the shaping of the first people. This part is familiar to anyone who has read Sumerian creation material. Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag take clay from the edge of the Abzu, the freshwater deep, and from it they form the first workers. This much lines up with the Atrahasis epic and other well-known Sumerian sources. But then the tablet does something the other creation texts do not do. It pauses on the shaping itself and describes the first humans as having been made whole in the mind, a phrase that appears nowhere else in surviving Sumerian literature. The scribe elaborates. The first people, the tablet says, did not need the mouth to carry a thought from one person to another. What one held in the mind, the tablet says, the other could hold beside it, without the space between two bodies mattering at all. Read plainly. This is describing something close to what we would now call direct, nonverbal communication between minds. Not telepathy in the theatrical sense of party tricks and stage mentalism, but something closer to what a modern reader might recognize in the uncanny synchrony some twins report, or the wordless coordination of people who have spent decades beside each other. The tablet calls this capacity, in the clearest rendering available, the shared voice, and it describes it not as an occasional gift given to a few, but as the baseline condition of the earliest humans. Every one of them had it. It was not special. It was simply what a mind was, before anything was taken away. The text then shifts tone. The transmission marker style, calm and administrative up to this point, becomes noticeably more careful, the way a scribe writes when he is describing something he was told not to write plainly. The tablet says that Enki, watching the first generations of humans, became troubled. Not because the shared voice was harmful. The tablet is explicit that it caused no sickness, no disorder, and no conflict among the humans themselves. Enki became troubled, the text says, because the shared voice meant that humans held knowledge in common the way water holds together in a single pool. And a pool, the tablet says, cannot be divided, measured, or owned. It can only be diverted, and if it cannot be divided, it cannot be ruled. This is the pivot point of the entire fragment, and it is worth sitting with, because it reframes everything that follows. The tablet is not describing an accident. It is describing a deliberate act of engineering, undertaken not because the shared voice was dangerous to humans, but because it was dangerous to the arrangement the makers intended to build on top of humanity. A workforce that shares one mind cannot be divided into castes. It cannot be told different things by different mouths, and believe all of them equally. It cannot be made to compete with itself, because there is no private thought to turn against a neighbor's private thought. The tablet's language here is unusually blunt for Sumerian religious material, which typically wraps its politics in layers of divine drama. This text simply states the problem. A species that shares its mind cannot be governed the way a species of isolated minds can be governed. And so, the tablet says, Enki went to the house of binding, a phrase Sumerologists associate elsewhere with acts of genetic and physical alteration performed on early humans, the same house referenced obliquely in fragments describing the shortening of the human lifespan and the introduction of disease as a control mechanism. And there, the tablet says, the two threads that carried the shared voice were drawn together and made one. And from that day, the text says, the voice of one man could no longer reach the mind of another without the mouth to carry it. Two threads were drawn together and made one. If you know what chromosome 2 is, that sentence should stop you in your tracks, because that is, almost verbatim, a description of a chromosomal fusion event, not a mutation that happened to occur. An act, described by the scribe as intentional, in which two separate strands were deliberately joined into a single one. And the joining itself is what ended the capacity. The tablet calls the shared voice. Now, the responsible thing to say here is that translation of ancient technical-sounding language is treacherous, and that two threads drawn together could just as easily be poetic language for a marriage, a covenant, a binding of fate. Sumerian literature is full of exactly that kind of metaphor. Mainstream Assyriology, to the extent it has ever touched a fragment this obscure, would almost certainly read it that way, and that reading deserves to be taken seriously. But the difficulty with the ordinary reading is the same difficulty that shows up again and again in fragments like this one. The ordinary reading explains the poetry. It does not explain the specificity. It does not explain why the text insists twice that the joining happened to something plural, something that existed as two before it existed as one. It does not explain why the very next line of the tablet describes the consequence not as a change in fate or fortune, which is what you would expect from a covenant metaphor, but as a change in what the mind is now capable of doing. And it does not explain why, 4,000 years later, actual human geneticists, working with actual microscopes, would identify actual paired chromosomes fused into a single strand as one of the defining differences between the human genome and the genome of every other great ape alive. Whether the tablet is describing a real event, or whether it is a coincidence of translation and imagination, the text does not stop at the mechanism. It goes on to describe what happens to a species after the shared voice is removed. And this is where the fragment becomes less a historical curiosity and more a document that a modern reader may recognize uncomfortably well. The tablet says that once the joining was complete, the first humans woke to find themselves, for the first time, alone inside their own skulls. The text uses a phrase that translates roughly as the walking apart, describing the sudden and total privacy of thought that followed the loss of the shared voice. And the tablet claims that this privacy, rather than being experienced as freedom, was experienced by the first generations as a wound. The scribe writes that the earliest humans wept without knowing why, that they reached for each other in the dark and could not find what they were reaching for, and that the mouth, the tongue, the invented sounds that would eventually become language, was given to them afterward, not as a gift, but as a replacement. A crutch was handed to a species that had just had its legs taken away. If this reading holds even loosely, it reframes something almost every human being has felt and never had language for: the specific loneliness of being unable to fully transmit an inner experience to another person, no matter how carefully you choose your words. The tablet would say that feeling is not a flaw in human communication. It is a memory. It is the residue of a capacity that used to work without effort. Now straining through a bottleneck it was never designed to fit through. And the tablet insists, in its final surviving section, that the capacity was never fully destroyed, only narrowed, only suppressed to the point of uselessness in most people, most of the time. The scribe writes that the joining was not perfect, that in every generation since, in every population without exception, there are those in whom the old thread reasserts itself, faintly, unpredictably, in moments the tablet calls the thin hours, the edges of sleep, the edges of danger, the edges of death. And here the text lists what it calls the 7 remaining threads, the 7 places where the shared voice still leaks through the boundary that was built to contain it. The first thread is the waking of the mother. Across every culture and every era for which we have record, mothers report waking in the night, seconds before a child cries, with no external signal at all. Modern explanation points to conditioned listening, a nervous system attuned even in sleep. The tablet offers a different explanation. It says the bond between a mother and an infant is the one bond in human life that was never fully able to be severed, because it existed before the infant's own mouth had learned to carry anything. The shared voice, the tablet says, survives longest wherever language has not yet arrived to replace it. The second thread is the thing twins do. Twins across cultures and across centuries have reported finishing each other's thoughts, feeling each other's pain from a distance, sensing a twin's distress before any phone call arrives to confirm it. Researchers who study this call it heightened familiarity, shared environment, and statistical coincidence, remembered selectively. The tablet calls it the clearest surviving proof that the old thread runs strongest between those who were formed closest together, in the same blood, at the same time, in the same dark. The third thread is the sentence you did not finish, because the other person already knew how it ended. Every long relationship accumulates moments like this. A spouse, a sibling, an old friend, speaking your own next word before you say it, and both of you laughing, a little unsettled, at how often it happens. The tablet calls this the shared voice at its most worn, still functioning, but only across the shortest distances, only after the longest exposure, a single thread doing the work that once required no thread at all. The fourth thread is the sudden, unexplained certainty that something has happened to someone you love before any message reaches you. Nearly everyone has a story like this, or knows someone who does. A feeling of wrongness that arrives hours before the phone call, a compulsion to check on someone that turns out, later, to have been necessary. Statisticians will tell you, correctly, that we remember the hits and forget the thousands of misses. The tablet does not ask you to believe otherwise. It only notes that the feeling itself, whatever its cause, describes exactly the kind of transmission the shared voice was built to carry. Not words, not images, simply the raw fact of a change in someone else's state, arriving without a messenger. The fifth thread is the dream you share without realizing it. Two people, unconnected by any obvious signal, dreaming the same unusual image on the same night, a specific house, a specific animal, a specific stranger's face, and only discovering the overlap by accident, days later in conversation. Rare enough to be dismissed as coincidence every single time it happens, and yet common enough that almost everyone has a story like this somewhere in their family. The tablet places this among the thin hours specifically, because sleep, it says, is the closest a modern human ever comes to the condition of the first humans. The mouth silent, the guard down, the old thread briefly permitted to do what it was built for. The sixth thread is the room that goes quiet at once. A group of people, mid-conversation, all falling silent within the same second, for no announced reason. The old half-joking phrase for it exists in almost every language on Earth. A phrase that assumes, without ever needing to explain itself, that something passed through the room that had nothing to do with sound. The tablet says a room can hold a faint echo of the shared voice, the way a held breath holds air, briefly, collectively, and then releases it. And no one in the room can say afterward what exactly happened, only that something did. The seventh thread, and the one the tablet lingers on longest, is grief. Specifically, the report. Recorded in every era, in every culture, dismissed by every generation of skeptics and repeated by every generation of mourners, of a presence, a final wordless contact, arriving at or near the moment someone dies, received by someone who loved them, often at a distance, often with no way of knowing in the moment that anything had happened at all. The tablet does not call this a haunting. It does not call it a ghost. It says that of all the bonds the joining tried to sever, this is the one it fails at most completely, because at the moment a mind is leaving the body it was bound to, the tablet says, the old thread reasserts itself one final time, fully, without the mouth's interference, precisely because the mouth is no longer needed by the one who is going. The scribe closes the fragment with a line that the independent researcher who translated it flagged, in her own private notes, as the sentence she found hardest to render with confidence, because the grammar allows for more than one reading. In its most literal form, it says something close to this. The thread was joined, not cut. What is joined can be drawn apart again, if enough hands pull at once. Some translators would read that as a simple statement of biological fact. A fusion, after all, is not an amputation, and in principle a fused chromosome could, under vanishingly rare conditions, separate again. Others read it as the researcher herself seems to have, based on the underlining in her notes, as a promise, or a warning, that whatever was taken from the first humans in the house of binding was taken deliberately, was taken because it was inconvenient to whoever built the arrangement humans have lived inside ever since, and that the tablet's final gesture is not an ending. It is an invitation to notice. How many of the 7 threads you have felt yourself, how many people in your life you have quietly wondered about, how easily a species that supposedly lost the shared voice 4,000 years ago keeps finding new words for the same experience in every single language it has ever spoken. This is, in the end, the strangest part of the fragment, stranger than the fusion, stranger than the house of binding, stranger even than the claim that a chromosome now confirmed by modern genetics was described in clay long before microscopes existed to find it. The strangest part is how ordinary the 7 threads are. None of them are exotic. None of them require you to have had a paranormal experience, a near-death encounter, or a supernatural sighting. They require only that you have been a mother or a twin, or in a long relationship, or worried about someone you love, or shared a strange dream, or sat in a room that went quiet, or grieved someone. Which is to say, they require only that you have been human, living the ordinary life of a species the tablet says was never meant to feel this alone in the first place. What makes this fragment harder to file away as a one-off curiosity is that the idea it describes does not stay confined to Eridu. Once you know what you are looking for, the same rumor turns up again and again, in places that had no access to Sumerian tablets and no reason to borrow from them. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, certain songlines are described as having once been walkable by more than one mind at a time, a shared inheritance of place and memory that later generations could only access one person at a time, one voice at a time, as though something that used to be collective had been divided into individual portions. In parts of West Africa, oral tradition preserves the idea of a first language that was not spoken but felt, a language that existed before the tongue, replaced by the spoken word only after some disruption. The storytellers no longer agree on the details of. Among several indigenous nations of North America, twin births carry a weight far beyond biological curiosity, treated in some traditions as a visible reminder of a bond the rest of humanity used to share more widely. And within Vedic literature, there are references to a state called ekatva, a kind of unity of mind between beings, described as the natural condition of early consciousness before it fractured into the separate, isolated selves we now take for granted. None of these traditions describes a chromosome. None of them mention Enki or a house of binding. But every one of them describes the same underlying shape, a unity that used to exist, a fracture that occurred, and a scattering of small, stubborn proofs that the unity has never been entirely erased. This is, of course, exactly the kind of pattern a skeptic would expect to find if the idea in question is simply a universal human coping story, a way of explaining the discomfort of being alone inside your own head by inventing a golden age before the isolation began. Loneliness is old enough and common enough that it would be strange if no culture had ever built a myth to explain it away. That is a fair and serious objection, and it deserves to sit here undisguised rather than argued around. But it is worth noticing that the objection explains why the myth would exist. It does not explain why the myth, across cultures with no contact and no shared language, keeps landing on the same specific mechanism. Not a curse, not a punishment for pride, not a flood or a fire, but a division, a splitting of something that used to be one thing into two, which is the exact word, joined and drawn apart, that a modern geneticist would also reach for if asked to describe what chromosome 2 looks like under a microscope. The fragment itself remains, as far as any public record shows, uncatalogued in any major collection database, its precise present location undocumented since the annex records were disrupted. The researcher who translated it in the 1980s passed away without publishing her full notes in any academic venue, and what survives of her work exists only in the private correspondence of a small handful of independent Sumerologists who have never agreed on how the tablet should be classified. Genuine anomaly, elaborate misreading, or something in between that mainstream Assyriology has simply never had the incentive to resolve. That ambiguity is itself worth sitting with. Not every fragment gets a clean answer. Not every claim about the ancient world resolves into either total vindication or total debunking. Sometimes what survives is a single translation, a single set of private notes, and a claim strange enough that it is easier for an institution to file it away than to spend the resources disproving it properly. What you can decide for yourself, without needing anyone's peer review, is whether the 7 threads mean anything to you. Have you ever known what someone else was about to say before they said it? Whether you have ever woken at the exact moment you were needed? Whether you have ever felt, in the space of a single breath, that someone you loved had just changed somewhere far away, before any phone rang to confirm it? The tablet does not ask you to believe in the Anunnaki, or in Enki, or in a house of binding buried somewhere beneath 4,000 years of sand. It asks something much smaller and much harder to dismiss. It asks whether the loneliness you have felt your entire life, the specific, particular loneliness of never quite being able to get a thought all the way out of your own head and into someone else's, has ever once struck you as strange. Not sad, not unusual, strange, as though it were not the natural condition of a mind, but the leftover shape of something that used to fit differently. The thread was joined, the scribe wrote, not cut. And somewhere in the quiet of your own life, in a moment you may not even remember clearly, there is a good chance you have already felt it try to pull apart again.